Okay, so I don't know why he said I was really good at compilers and transpilers. It's just a straight up lie. But I know a little bit about them. But thank you. So first of all, I'm really glad about the order of the talks, because what we got before this was a talk in the practical about making sure your stuff works. And I'm going to talk about making things weird. And you want to know your stuff works when you make things weird. So write tests, please. So the talk is titled Use Bable in a Modern Working Environment, but the secret title is Future Tool. Okay, so just follow me a little bit as I talk to you about what I think is one of the best tools to come out for modern software development in a long time. And I know that's a high bar. It was really up there, but I promise it is. So two things about this slide. One, you'll notice that it's gray, and it's got very good grammar, right? And it's a truth. Slides like this will always be facts, as far as I can do. Slides like this, they're opinions of mine, so they're almost fact, right? And then, so for example, software pretty much rocks. That's an opinion. A lot of people hate software. I hate some of my software. So here's another one. This is a training. I have some notes, right? Okay, my notes are, one, I talk fast. So if I talk too fast, just say something. Boom. I will have time for questions. That's an opinion. Because I should have started a timer on my Android that I set up 5 minutes ago, and I didn't, and now it's too late. Okay, so fact, Bable is a build tool, and it will always be a build tool. It wasn't always a build tool, but it is now, and people use it as build tools. Who uses Bable as a build tool? Cool. Just make sure, is there anybody who uses Bable for not build tooling? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so it is a build tool, but it's more, right? Bable is a cispilier. Okay, so who knows what cispilier is? No? Okay. So let's go over some basics. Okay, compiler, program that transports source to another computer. Okay, this is not basic, but you could probably Google this, and well, you can Google this and get this information, because this is what I got from. Boom. Transpiler is another type of compiler, although compiler is a type of compiler. A transpiler is a program that transfers some source into equivalent source. So one of the first transpilers that out there, not the first, but one of the first that became a modern mainstream, was called Unholy. And what it is, it straight up turned Ruby into Python. And it didn't do it by reading. First of all, it wrote its own parser, which is wild. Something you don't see in languages these days. They come with parsers usually, if they're good. But it wrote its own parser, and it was bad. And two, it didn't try to do any sort of comparative, it didn't try to be smart. If it saw an if condition, it just wrote an if condition on the side, just printed it out, So it was very slow. It was written by a fellow by the name of Y Lucky Stiff. But that was one of the first modern, huh? Yeah, chunky bacon. First modern transpiler. So okay, the cispilier. So this is, you notice the color is different. This is opinion, because this isn't a real word. So trans, right? Cispilier is a program that turns source into source, which okay, what does that mean, right? So first of all, let's learn some Latin. Trans means across, right? Transcontinental. Cis means same side, okay? So this, what language is this? Probably. Okay, yeah, it's JavaScript. Specifically ES6, right? So if you take this code and you put it in a source file and you run your Bable build tool on it, assuming you have some rules and conditions set up, you will get this out, which is also JavaScript. And it means the same exact thing, 100%. So why is there two things that mean the same thing, and why would you write one the one way, right? Well, a couple of things. One, in browsers, const can give you a warning, or even an error in some implementations if you change the value, which is good, because you want to be sure that when you set this value, you don't have to think, maybe, what if it changes? What if it's changing on the line? Well, with const, you can be sure it's not going to change. In fact, I prefer const over almost 100%. Also, you get things like default, which is nice, and you don't have to write that little or condition. So a cispilier is special because it follows this rule. You can break upwards. You can destroy people's futures in terms of what they want for a language, but you can't break what people have already decided. All right? So when you have something like Bable and you try to and you write your, if you use something like Babel, you will always be able to write the oldest JavaScript you can think of, like in terms of syntax. That will always work because they can't break that, right? They're not allowed to. It's part of the rules. So that's what makes it not a transpiler. It's a cispilier. It will always go from JavaScript to JavaScript, okay? And that's where I put that word, right? So here's a good example of this. I've got a mix of these. You would never write this unless you have like a legacy application. And in fact, that's a good value of Bable, I think. Is we have this two types of doing the same thing, one old school and one new school, I guess. And they're in the same, and they actually work. And Bable will just turn that into this. There's nothing. It doesn't have to touch it at all, right? So that's the rule for cispilers, and Bable is a cispiler. So I want to posit an opinion here. The cispilers, they solve, who has heard of the Lisp curse? Come on, anybody. OK, that's fine, that's fine, that's fine. So it's an old school article back before they were called blogs. And you can go look, if you Google Lisp curse, you'll get it. But basically, it's this, right? So Lisps and Forth, they were easier to modify. In Forth, you could actually change the comment character in line. And any code after that would fail if you were using the old comment character. And it was cool with this. You could just do that kind of crap, right? And you can't do that in JavaScript until now, right? So now you're like, oh, that's terrible. Why would I do that? And so the Lisp curse is essentially like, let's say you wanted to design the concept of set, because set didn't always exist in JavaScript. It's especially map, like things like map. They didn't exist. So you design a version of map that defaults to undefined when the key doesn't exist, and you define a map where if the key doesn't exist, it raises an exception. And if you try to use each other's code, it's broken. Nothing happens, right? Who's wins? Last comes in. That's what happened with Lisp. So Bable works. Bable fixes this problem because community in JavaScript came before modifiability, right? Bable adds modifiability, but we had community first. Lisp doesn't have an NPM. Forth doesn't have a Ruby gems. They just don't exist because anybody can change anything. So here's a good example, right? So this is an ES6. Well, it's ES6 plus, right? So we have the arrow function, right? And we have the export default. And Bable just turns it into this, which is like massive, right? And okay, that kind of sucks. But Bable doesn't care what you write because it's got some rules on how to turn it into things that actually work, right? And it can be long. So it's not just like changing things around. It's actually figuring out what you wanted and giving you a reasonable approximation of what you wanted in something that, in a way that will work on basically anywhere. So I also posit that JS is a boring feature without cispilers. The thing was, if you don't have Bable, you don't have a lot of stuff. Without Bable, you probably don't have JSX for a long time. Who here uses JSX all the time? Do you like JSX? OK, you barely get that. Probably not going to get that without something like Bable. You don't get cool things like ES6 as easily without Bable. Who remembers CoffeeScript? OK, how many of you still use it? OK, who remembers iced CoffeeScript? OK, this happened the last time I asked that question, and that's terrifying to me as someone who designs programming languages. So CoffeeScript didn't have asynchronous functionality, and some person out there was like, I really want it to have asynchronous functionality. And CoffeeScript's owner was like, well, go build your own CoffeeScript then. And so he did. He made something that was CoffeeScript, but with asynchronous functionality, or like advanced. I can't even remember what it is. That's how bad it is. He built he forked CoffeeScript and added some cool functionality, and I don't even remember. And I'm into this stuff, and I don't remember why. I think it was about asynchronous or async await or whatever. And he spent all that time, and no one remembers it because no one's willing to switch their entire stack over to some other person's transpiler just to use asynchronous tools. It's just not something you do in a workplace. But Bable, you can, right? So here's some cool stuff from Bable. This is the practical side part of the application, right? Here is I found this a couple of days ago, and it is like the weirdest thing I've ever seen. But it's like this stuff, just preface, the stuff I'm showing you was commonplace back when you did Lisp. You just did this stuff. So this is a npm package. You can install it in like 5 seconds, well, depending on your internet speed. You can install it, put it into your Bable setup, and you can start doing this. And you don't have to switch over, you don't have to compile a new version of Node. You don't have to clone somebody's fork that they're maintaining on their off time. It's just like it's part of the thing. And it gives you this. So this is some JavaScript and comments. Anything on the other side with that symbol, that double arrow symbol, is an assertion. So when you run your code, it will actually fail on this line with an assertion error. So you can write your tests like right next to your code, right? And this is a subset of a larger set of Bable plugins. And the other big thing, I don't have slides for this because it's too hard to kind of contain in a slide, but it allows you to write commentary and then access that commentary as an object in your REPL, and then interface with that. So if you wanted to make a web view for your documentation that's really fancy, you could. Or if you wanted to have tests that reference your documentation, it's wild. So this is like the one of them. Here's another. So this is actually inside of Babel's core official packages. So there's Bable plugins out there that are official, and they are in the repository along with other stuff like Stage 0 or ES 2016 or React, right? Those plugins that they're not in a preset. You're supposed to discover them. This is interesting. So this one, here's some code, and you write that bit, and you run your Bable to build, and it throws this error, right? That's kind of neat. Like it's informing. It's looking at your system and saying like, hey, did you mean foo? Are you sure you meant bar? Like foo's the only thing there. So, but I mean, to be fair, this is probably like something you should be doing in your linter. Like there's an area to figure out. We have to figure out over the next couple of years. Like where does the concern of Bable lie? So here's another one. This is a long npm package name, and there's a lot of these out there, but just bear with me. So inline environment variables. So let's say you have this code. Who's written this? Like a lot of people, right? This is common, right? It turns it into this, which then if you throw uglify.js on it, turns it into this, which then also turns it into this, right? Like this is, yeah, I mean like it just removed a whole bunch of code, and like you don't have to see that in development or production because like that's not going to happen. True is that's never going to else. So this is probably an asset pipeline concern though, right? Like you probably don't want your Bable to do it, but it can, all right? So Bable plugin feature flags I found today, and it's this. So your import is enabled from my features, and my features is like an ephemeral file. And it says, hey, if you have this feature, then code. And when you run Bable build, when you build your Bable and transpile it, or when you run it, it does this, like if it's enabled or not. So you can turn off features in production and locally for your building. And it becomes a really interesting thing where it's like, you know what? I really don't need to do A/B testing in my tests. Like if you've ever done A/B testing on your website and then written tests, that is a pain. Because then you're like, why is my test failing? Oh, it's because it's on the other side of the test. You know, and now I need to have it write a test that's like, oh, okay, if you're in this A/B test, if this side of the A/B test, then do this, and then it's pain. So why don't you just turn that off? You know, boom, gone during tests. You can do that. And of course, since it's false, there's nothing else. Here's another one. I use this everywhere. So who's ever written this, right? Like this sucks. No one wants this. Bable root just lets you write this, and it does it, right? Practical, right? Let me turn the brightness up. OK, so I use Bable in my projects constantly. And I've seen a lot of people who use Bable in their web applications. And they just kind of like see it as a build tool. And I see it as more, right? So I'm going to show you. I don't know how much time I have left. OK. OK, so I'm going to show you two projects I'm working on, right? They're side projects. And they both use Bable in different contexts. So Harvester is a process that runs constantly and harvests information. It's not for the NSA, don't worry. And so it's like an app. You can think of it. This is like your regular web application, if you will, right? Like it's not a web application, but like the patterns in here are basically the same. So first of all, you'll notice that my build script just Bable builds everything that's not test and is in the source directory and dumps it into transpiled source. Okay? And then if I want to run random scripts, I just do this, and it just like pipes the file. You just hey, I do npm run script foo.js, and it will run that with my Bable setting. So if I just want to run something, and they have all my watch scripts, right? That's not important. That's not part of Bable. So that's the tooling that you've got with Bable. You can either run something like you would with Node, if you ever type Node, or you can run something to build it from file to file, right? To actually like compile it. So here are the Bable plugins I have. I've listed them out. Now, most of you are probably going to be using presets, right? Yeah? OK. And that's what I started using as well when I started. But I found like there were things in those presets that I didn't need because Node 6 had just come out. And this is what I use. So these 5 things. Exports, because that's not in Node 6 yet. Object spread, because that's not in Node 6 yet. Exponential operator, which I've never used and could delete. And the common JS, because Node hasn't figured out what it wants to do for requires yet. Well, it does, but it doesn't know how it's handled with objects. And then destructuring, because it doesn't have that yet. So like all these things, like Node just haven't pulled over yet. And I'm using, and I'm giving myself the ability to use. So this lets me run on Node 6 and use these fancy features that Node 6 hasn't come out with. So I don't have to wait to use cool features, right? So, and I think that, yeah, so this is the only plugin. So this is a web application. It's all in the dev dependency, so it's not in production, right? So you build your thing, and you got this directory, this transpiled.js. And so we'll look at it. Oops. OK, so these are the files. It just builds them. That's all. We can actually look at them. Let's look at one. Source as credential prayer. That's a good one. So this is what pops out. You know, I'm just going to clear the page and then. So first, puts the use strict up there because, like, I guess that's the thing in JavaScript. I don't know. I've never had to deal with it because Bable does it for me. Fair point out. I started doing Node like 6 months ago. And like I've never had to think about use strict because I use Bable. Like that's cool, right? I feel like it's cool. There's a whole generation of mistakes that I can just ignore. Probably to my detriment. There's probably going to be like something later, and I'll be like, what is this? And it's like, oh well, Bable hit it for you. It does some ES6 stuff, and then some export stuff, and then it does Ramda. Like this is the file that it outputs. It just keeps my comments for some reason. Maybe I should get rid of those. Who knows? The point is, it does that. And here's the actual file. Oops. So here's the actual file. It's right there. So I just like import zip from Ramda, import something from a relative file. Oh, it's the interrupt required default. OK. And then, sorry?
Can you push it up to the top?
Yeah. That's a good point. Thank you very much. That's the file. I'm not doing anything special in the file. My file doesn't care about where it's going because Babel's handling that. So it just creates these files, and that's all it does. And so now I've got, so this is your web application, right? You'll build it up, you push it up, it'll build, it'll use the transpiled directory, and then you're done. This is an npm package. And actually, you know what? I'm going to just like quickly switch to another npm package because I don't think this is actually published. So I have like a couple of published. They're not here. OK. So here is, oh, Christ. I should not have done that. that was a mistake. No modules. OK. So here is a package I push. It's called SQL Watch. And it's just, all it does is just watch your SQL files. So there's two things to note here, right? Whenever you push up to npm, who has published a package? OK. If you ever like had to commit your distribution directory and then push that up to npm, it all sucks because it's compiled content. You don't have to do that. That's not something you have to do. So I'll show you why. So right here is the important part. I delete the transpiled directory. I make it again because there's no rm make dir, sadly. And I just compile it. And then that's it. That's the entire thing of that, right? So that pilots a transpiled directory. And then in my git ignore, I ignore the transpiled directory. So I never commit my generated code. I suggest that's a pattern you should take on. Don't commit generated code. You can always make it again. You don't need to keep it. That's hoarding. So then in npm ignore, it's the same thing. So npm ignore copies from your git ignore. But you just copy over your git ignore and admit the transpiled. So the transpiled goes to npm. People can download it. And now they have their source, transpiled source and the raw source. So here's this. It's just this. That's all. OK, so that's just Bable and for those two projects. And it's the same. Like if I do a transpiled, it's this source. There's a file there. And it's just this big file that I don't care about. So now for like, what is a front-end project look like? So am I still good on time? He's gone. Oh, great. OK, so look, here we go. So this is a front-end project, an internal project I'm working on, and it's just like a stat screen. And this is the nightmare that is the Babel here. So this is like where Babel starts to break apart, right, for browsers. It's like that's like the packages, and that's actually thinned down. It used to be twice as long, because I was like experimenting. I was like, oh, Babel's cool. I'll do everything, and I just like put everything in there. And there was actually one point where I had one that was like, oh, its entire job was to, OK, so you know how you do, I don't do this, but you know how you do var a comma b equals and then 1 comma 2 where you like group your variables. I never like found that interesting. But there's actually a plugin that does that for you, a Bable plugin that does that for you, except it breaks when there's another ordering plugin, and it just shoves random code in between. And turns out JavaScript's not cool with that. So it just like freaks out, and you get this error message. It's like, look, you tried to assign like an entire chunk of code to a variable, but it doesn't look right. Anyway, so like you can get dangerous with these. I mean, it's all generated content, so like it doesn't matter. You just like regenerate it without the thing that you messed up. But you can get to bad space. Like all of this is like half of this is only because the browsers don't have these things. And I think this is actually what I consider greenfield browser Babel. Like this is like stuff greenfield doesn't have, and there's other stuff. OK, so I don't know if I have time for questions, but feel free to hit me with questions.
Okay. Yeah, hit them with questions.
You.
So when you're using transpilers and the equivalent, this like is a big issue with me in CoffeeScript, is testing, debugging, and how much overhead are you adding in the transpile step? You're going to be testing against the transpile code as opposed to the code that you've been writing.
Yep.
So,
OK, that's a good question. So unlike the previous speaker, and there's no like right way to do this, let me see if I can't find it. So I keep my tests in the same file as the code that they're in. So not same file, same directory. So here I have source and low. Here's a test. So here's high band term. There's an index file, which is this thingy, and the test itself, which is mocha-chai. And mocha-chai is in ES6, so like I just run that. But Mocha has a specific thing, test. Here we go. So you can list all the compilers that you want it to like run through. And it's like a dozen. And so like I have found like I guess your question is what's the overhead like?
Well, and debugging, right?
OK.
Testing is one part. How much speed are you after
Yeah. So
delay are you adding, but then debugging?
there's almost none. Like here, I'll show you. That's how much time I have to wait. Like that's it. And then I don't even have to wait for that for tests because it's doing it in memory, which is even faster. Like half the cost of this is writing to file. Secondly, for tests, like there's almost no performance overhead I've noticed. If they are, it's a mistake in the plugin you're using. Like most of them are very, especially the Babel specific ones are highly optimized. 2, for debugging, it sucks, like hard. Like Node Inspector didn't work for a long time. I can't tell you all the fairy tales, but it sucked hard. Node Inspector just didn't work. Transpile plugin, I wish I could even show you. When you like have a function that doesn't work, especially an arrow function, it's just like, man, it's somewhere. And you just have to deal with that. It's like the path to it is like inside some virtual memory space. And it's like, oh, OK, great. One thing I've learned to combat is don't use arrow functions. I know they're fancy. Use them for like small things. But like I used to use arrow functions everywhere. And it was a nightmare. And you'll notice that like I would have, earlier in my Node career, I would have made that an arrow function 100%. And now I don't. And I was like, oh, like it doesn't matter because the file name is the name of the thing. And no, it turns out that sucks in debugging because it just like, it has no name sometimes. And then even when it does, it's like F1. And you just don't know where that's at. So yes, debugging sucks. It's still better than what it was because I feel like I have, like this is the good language for me. Other questions? You.
I was curious if I could see an example of your Babel RC.
Yeah.
What you're loading onto that versus another. OK.
That's what it is.
So you're just doing plugins.
Yes.
So there's no environment or
No.
presets or anything.
No. So I've tried to avoid plugins that require extensive configuration. That said, there are some really cool ones, like one that like gives you shortcuts to paths, and you have to map it in your RC. One thing I found a problem is there's just no easy way to share this type of file. Like this won't work in another Node project because maybe it's for a browser and it's not needing enough. and the only option you have is to make your own preset, but now you've just created work for yourself, right? It's like, honestly, I found an easier time just copying and pasting. And then, so yeah, it's a pain. Plus, like for every one of these, you also have to have so there's a package JSON. Like, and then package JSON, you have to list as a dependency. So that can be fun to keep track of, not? So like, because maybe like you remove one from your RC, but you forget to move it from your install, and it's just there. So yeah, no, it's, I try to keep that as simple as possible because I went wild and it sucked. Any other questions? Yes.
You ever still use Webpack or Rainbolt?
So yeah, actually at my work, which is Lauren Wolf, we're hiring, please talk to me. We have a React Redux front end that's like heavily stable to a Rails application. And we use Webpack. And I mean, Webpack is a build tool with a lot of functionality. Bable is way more. And there's a reason, like if you notice, like React Native is using Bable. And not because Webpack isn't popular. It's because like Bable lets you do some really crazy stuff. But Webpack's just not going to give you this functionality. It does cool things with the loaders. Like that was really neat, I felt. You can do some dangerous things. Like I've seen someone install a Webpack JSON loader and then like time zone data, and then just the app goes because it's just like in memory, it's got all this JSON data. Any other questions? No?
Oh, I got it.
Shoot.
So Bable doesn't create like bundle files, though.
No.
Right.
Nope. It's a one-to-one. Although you can make it do a single file, it's a one-to-one thing. Your job. In fact, the browser one does. The browser plugin stuff does. But no, it's just turning a file of JavaScript into another file of JavaScript with the context of the AST in that. Now you can do broader, like say, hey, and then like you're in Babylon, which is the parser. You're like, do this if you see something else in another AST tree. But it's best to just like take what you've got and turn it into something else. Cool.
All right, give it up for Kurtis.
My name is Sarah Rosh. I am Sarah Rosh on Twitter and Sarah forward and backwards on GitHub. I am senior front-end developer at Purebred Breeders, and if you are looking for an adorable purebred puppy, we can help you find one. I'm also really into knitting and comic books. A little backstory. I worked at an ad agency for 6 years. It was my first job out of school. I launched somewhere around 100